This is PowerPoint 1.2, which is the second PowerPoint in Epic 1, dealing with industrial development and conglomeration in the latter 19th century. And the way that I think I'm going to do these right now with these PowerPoints is I'm going to put a version of the PowerPoint without narration on Blackboard, and then I'm going to put a web link to a video of the PowerPoint, which will be on YouTube. That seemed to work pretty well. It's a little time intensive getting the thing uploaded and converted to a WMV file, but then it goes onto YouTube, and I think it's a lot easier to access that way. But I want you also to have the PowerPoint unnarrated to study from. Okay, so we start off here with a real quick, easy lesson in comparative advantage. Okay, and again, this is not an economics class. We don't have to worry about the hardcore technical definitions of this. Comparative advantage is based on a very simple economic principle, that being opportunity cost, which is essentially to do or have one thing, you have to give up doing or having something else. We know this as students, do we not? If we decide to study for our history, okay, we can't be studying economics or studying psychology or working or playing video games. Okay, to do or to have one thing, you have to give up doing or having something else. What comparative advantage is based on is the idea that a player, okay, a participant, has a comparative advantage in something if they give up less of the alternative in doing it. Let's just take as an example of that current history, the United States and the People's Republic of China. Now, in point of fact, in terms of absolute advantage, the United States can still has a productive capacity in manufacturing that is greater than China's. Okay, but every unit of a manufactured product the United States has, they have to give up more in terms of their specialization, which is currently services and technology. Whereas the Chinese, a labor-intensive, not capital-intensive, not high-skill-leveled population, gives up less services and technology when they produce manufactured goods. Okay? Well, now we look at U.S. history. In colonial times, the specialization, the comparative advantage of the United States, the U.S., the colonies of the time, was agriculture, primary industries, agriculture and extraction. Extraction is mining. Okay, this is low value added, low levels of technology, low skill levels. This was during the time of the Navigation Acts and the mercantile system with Great Britain. Okay, and so agriculture. Well, in the latter part of the 18th century and the early 19th century, this specialization, this comparative advantage, changes to light industry, principally textiles. This develops in the latter 18th century after the development of the cotton gin, and goes into the 19th century with a number of those things you study in U.S. History 1. Okay, principally as a result of trade policy of the United States of the Jeffersonian administration, and some others. The tariffs that went through the early part of the 19th century helped to foster the development of light industry in the United States. Okay, and then from there, by really the 1850s, and that's what we're going to really talk about in this presentation, we have a transition from that, from light industry, into heavy industry. Heavy industry is much more capital intensive. You have a slightly higher skill level in your labor force. Now, with all those things, okay, and this is just a basic idea of development economics. The basics of development economics is very simple, and we don't need to degenerate into the technical discussion of it. Just real quickly, everybody starts out in primary industries. Okay, they all develop agriculture and extraction, low value added, etc., like I said before. The idea is to maximize production of this, exploit it to its maximum potential, gain a surplus, and then take that surplus and invest in the next stage, which is light industry. Then from light industry, you do the same thing. You maximize production of it, you exploit it to its greatest advantage, develop a surplus, then invest in heavy industry. Then you do the same thing with heavy industry until you get to services and tech. Okay, and that's right now where the United States is. That began really in the 1960s. And so we have the rise of heavy industry. What we have here is we have just some data. This data is gleaned from a book that I used when I taught U.S. economic history a couple of years back here at Robert Morris. And the book we used is an outstanding textbook on the subject. It's by Walton and Rockoff. And the data here comes from Walton and Rockoff. I cite them, I think, on the next slide. But you see, from 1840 to 1859, 7.8% of the GDP, 4.6% GDP growth. From 1860 to 69, now that shouldn't surprise us that it's down a little bit because that's the time of the Civil War. Then from 1870 to 1899, we have a rapid GDP growth of averaging 4.4% annually. Now, and you see this 1870 1899. The reason it's going to actually be greater than that until 1892, but in 93 we have a contraction with the credit crisis of 1893, and that's kind of the culminating conclusion of the economic development in this epoch, in this epoch. Okay, until the end of the 19th century, is that in 1893 the U.S. economy essentially melts down. Because it's been overheated, and we'll get to that over and over and over again. We'll see that over and over. Here we have figures on steel production, and here I've cited Walton and Rockoff. The precipitous increase from 1870 to 1880 is largely due to a technological advance that we'll get to in a second. We'll discuss the technological advances, but they developed two different systems, an open hearth system and more efficiently a Bessemer process. We're not going to get into the technical details of how you produce steel with these processes. It's just enough to know that they had technological advances in the production of steel. You see the figures there. Now, technological improvements. We have the steam engine in industry. The steam engine is developed actually in the early part of the 19th century. Okay, its first use will be steam engines in shipping in 1811. Okay, that's when they'll develop the first steamship. It won't be really until the 1870s. Prior to that, it's water that is your primary source of power in the water wheel. If you've ever seen the old water wheels that go by river systems, particularly for grist mills and things like that, that's why most industrial facilities up until 1870 were located by rivers, because the river would provide your power system. Well, once we start to use steam, we don't need that as much. We still need the river to feed, because the way steam is going to work is you boil up the steam, it creates pressure, and that's going to drive your turbines and create your power. Okay, so you still need some steam there. That's going to be replaced ultimately when you start to use coal more, and especially when you start to use petroleum products. We see the expansion of coal as a power source, and then the development of the electric light bulb in the 1870s. And we have the famous quote from Thomas Edison, who developed it, that he attempted over 1,000 different types of filaments before he successfully got one. And they said to him, well, you failed 1,000 times. And he says, no, I found 1,000 different ways not to make a filament for a light bulb. All you need is one. You need one success. And it reminds me of the song from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, from the ashes of disaster grow the roses of success. And as a result of the development of electricity and really bringing electricity online, you have appliances, the development of appliances. The automobile will be invented in the United States in 1895, the aircraft in 1903. Submarines are very restrictively used in the Civil War. They're very basic machines. The submarine won't really come into its own until the early part of the 20th century. Then you have steam-powered ships, which I referenced earlier. Additional developments, we've talked about this. The steel industry, that's that comment I made on the open hearth and Bessemer process. Now, in addition to the development of this manufacturing sector, you also have developments in corporate organization, the most important of which will be on the next slide. But these are the early ones that we talk about. We've talked about this before, okay? The Waltham system, the Rhode Island system, and the Lowell system. The Lowell system is the first that puts all of the various stages of manufacturing together in one place and develops the factory. The Waltham system employed entire families to work in the factory, and actually it's the Rhode Island system that employed young women, although that was also the forerunner of the Lowell system. Okay, so you have a corporate organization that will lead to the development of factory work, and factory work will ultimately become shift work, where you'll have a continuous production process. We refer to it as the American system of manufacturing, where you have a continuous production process for 24 hours. You divide your labor into 3 different shifts. I don't know if any of you have ever had misfortune of doing shift work. I've done shift work as a janitor where you have the early shift, the middle shift, and the late shift, 8 hours apiece. You have interchangeable parts in the machine, so if a machine breaks down, you can simply either cannibalize another machine and replace the part, or it's standardized parts, so you have a standard production process producing them, and so it's a lot easier to fix your equipment. This is the one that is, I think, more significant, particularly this idea of the LLC, the Limited Liability Corporation. It's in the latter part of the 19th century. Prior to that, an industry is owned by an individual or a small group of individuals, a family. The Limited Liability Corporation changes that. The problem with an individual, an entrepreneurship, an individual, is that that individual is held responsible. So if the thing goes belly up, it's the individual that's going to go bankrupt. If something goes wrong, you can actually sue the individual. When we develop the Limited Liability Corporation, the corporation itself, becomes an entity. It becomes an organic being. We fund this thing principally in terms of the raising of capital through two sources: borrowing from banks, which we'll get to in a minute, or selling stock. Stock is part ownership in the corporation. And so if you own stock in a corporation, you are a co-owner in that corporation. The percentage of stock you own is your percentage share in the ownership of the corporation. The result of this, the legal ramifications of the corporate entity, is that no individual can be held accountable. You can hold the corporation accountable. If the corporation goes belly up, the corporation is bankrupt, but the individuals preserve their individual wealth. No individual human beings are actually held accountable. We've seen this if we've been paying at all attention to the U.S. economy over the last 15 to 20 years. We see the negative implications of this. People get away scot-free from that banking crisis. Very few individuals, in 2008, very few individuals were held accountable. That's because they're limited liability corporations. The individual can't be held accountable. And the footnote here from Hegel, in the Philosophy of Right, Hegel discusses the dialectical relationship between the infinite and the finite. And without getting into the abstraction of Hegel, it's very simple to understand. Take anyone, anything, an individual worker. Take me at Robert Morris, an individual adjunct faculty member. Robert Morris University existed before me, and when I'm done, when I've died, when I've given up, when I quit, whatever, it will exist after me. It approaches a more timeless feature. It is infinite. I am finite. I will eventually die. We see this with all corporations. The individuals eventually die, but the corporation can, at least hypothetically, endure indefinitely. The U.S. Steel Corporation was formed in 1901. It is now 114 years old. It has outlived any and all who've ever worked for it except for the current generation, including my father. Now, the implications of this, we want to go over this and make sure we understand it. Because ultimately what we're moving towards is an understanding of why it is that the U.S. economy melts down in the early 1890s. You have a transition to heavy industry. Heavy industry is very capital intensive, meaning it's expensive equipment. It uses really expensive equipment. When you're dealing with blast furnaces and hearths and all that kind of stuff and rolling mills, you're dealing with expensive capital equipment. To borrow for this, the investment necessary is going to place a strain on the credit of the banking system. In other words, it's going to place a strain on bank liquidity. And we'll deal with this at some length in the last PowerPoint on this epoch on monetary conditions. That's where we'll deal with this in full force. Right now, we're just hinting at it and getting some of the ideas, some of the ammunition behind it. So it's going to place a strain on the liquidity of the banking system to provide enough loans. Now, this is going to have an impact on the agricultural sector. From time immemorial, from the beginning of the United States, the agricultural sector depended on the banks for short-term loans and for long-term loans for investment. But really, the way that the agricultural sector worked, farmers would go to the bank and borrow money, and as collateral, use the next year's crop. That's how they would pay the money back. Okay? Well, now the banks don't have enough money to lend to the agricultural sector. And so as heavy industry develops and as it puts greater strain on the banking system, there's less money to go around. There's a limited supply of money in the system. So there's less money to go around to farmers and to other sectors of the economy. This is going to ultimately reduce the terms of trade of agriculture. We'll get to that when we get to agricultural development in a subsequent lecture. Now, the impact on labor, you see, first, transition from skilled labor to semi-skilled labor, and just kind of just a little aside here, without going into it too deeply. This is the substance of Marx's argument in Das Kapital. The argument that Marx launches is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, production, individual production, was handled by individual human beings. Okay, they were artisans. Okay, a shoemaker. With the industrialization, it dehumanizes human beings. All human beings are effectively animate machines. One is the same as another. Okay, they just stand there on an assembly line or in a factory turning a screwdriver all day. That dehumanizes them. It robs from humans, the availability of taking pride in their work and owning a piece of it. They become, in Marx's terms, they become animate machines. They become a factotum. Okay? The other thing that this is going to do with the Industrial Revolution and development is develop the economy of scale. Now, again, attempting as best I can to avoid the technical discussion of this. An economy of scale refers to mass production. When you begin to produce a thing, without getting into the technical economics of it, when you begin to produce a thing, you face your highest marginal cost, which is the cost to produce each unit. As you hire more laborers, okay, that cost per unit, as you expand production, that cost per unit is going to drop until it reaches some minimum point. Okay, that's the development of an economy of scale. With mass production, you develop an economy of scale that reduces the cost of production of individual units, and therefore reduces the cost of production of the overall and allows you to produce more. And so we have the development of an economy of scale. The other thing that's going to take place in the later 19th century, quite natural, people think this all the time. They say, okay, one of the advantages of capitalism is competition. Competition creates economic efficiency. Competition is better. Competition, forces innovation, etc., etc., etc. Okay, fine. The funny thing about competition is, though, that generally speaking, all of the competitions that I've ever been in, somebody wins, and somebody loses. Okay? Well, that's the way the economy works. Somebody wins, and somebody loses. That's competition. Originally, we have the development of natural monopolies. I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide. You see the definition of it here. The cost of production is too great to allow competition. Examples of this used to abound. They're a little bit less now, but for example, the railroad industry. The cost of laying the track, buying the land, maintaining the track, all that, raised the cost of production of rail transportation beyond the point where competition was feasible, because if competition were allowed, that would push the price of the product down, and it would ultimately push it down below the cost of production. Utility companies were like this until only recently, until the last 10 years. For example, in western Pennsylvania, Duquesne Light had monopolistic control. They were a natural monopoly. Why is this? Because the cost of the infrastructure to provide electricity, not just the power plants, but the lines, etc., the transformers, everything, okay, was too great to allow competition. Over a period of about 10 years, battles in court, they finally have decided, because of the technological improvements in the development of, in the provision of electricity, it's now open to competition. I'll go into that more in the next slide. Now, we have two types of mergers. mergers. We have horizontal mergers and vertical mergers, and they're very easy to understand the difference. Okay, a horizontal merger is when two producers of the same product merge together. Okay, so for example, if Coke and Pepsi were to become one corporation, that would be a horizontal merger. The most famous of these we'll get to in just a minute is the formation of the U.S. Steel Corporation, which will become the largest producer of steel in the world. It'll be actually the largest corporation of any kind in the world. A vertical merger is different. A vertical merger is where you merge, where an individual corporation will merge all of the various factors of production. And so let's take, for example, a producer of clothing. Okay, let's just take that as an example. Well, a vertical merger for them would be if they owned a farm where the cotton was grown. They then owned a textile mill where the cotton was turned into fabric. They then owned a seamstress shop that would turn that fabric into clothing. They then own the transportation line that carries one from the other at each stage of the process, and then they own the retail store where people come and buy the clothing. That's a vertical merger. Okay? And again, we have examples of that. Andrew Carnegie's Steel Corporation, before he became U.S. Steel, they were a horizontal merger. J.P. Morgan was the same way. Standard Oil of Ohio will attempt that, although they'll be more of a horizontal merger. Now, here we have a more technical discussion of natural monopoly. Let's take a look at this. The costs curve here. Yeah, wait a minute. Let me get my laser point. Okay, the cost curve here represents the cost of production. You see, exactly as I said, when you start out production, you face your highest cost. It drops down to a minimum point and then begins to rise again. Well, with a horizontal monopoly, or with a natural monopoly, that cost of production is sufficiently high. Here we have the demand for the product. Okay, the monopolist can charge a price right here and still make a profit. The distance between the demand for the product and the cost. That's price times quantity demanded greater than the cost. But if you allow for competition, what's going to happen is the additional producers are going to enter in. It's going to shift the supply curve out to the right. The price of the product is going to shift down, and as a result of it shifting down, we now have a higher demand, but we have a lower price, and you can see here that the price of the product is below the cost of the product. This is going to force producers to produce at a loss, which is going to remove any incentive to produce. Okay? So instead, we give them a protected natural monopoly. And then typically what's going to happen with a natural monopoly is the government's going to come in and try to regulate the price that they can charge to keep them from gouging the consumers. But monopolies have been my greatest conflict. I have been at war with monopolies for the better part of 30 years, okay? Because monopolies are contrary to the capitalist system. I'll give you an example. My first job, the first job I ever had, I was a canvasser. I went door to door begging money for an organization known as the Pennsylvania Alliance for Jobs and Energy. And what we did was we were a lobbying group that went to government in Harrisburg, state government, and tried to argue for greater regulatory control of the utility companies like Duquesne Light and Columbia Gas. Because by law, they were guaranteed a 5% profit. Now, who is guaranteed a 5% profit in a capitalist economic system? I'm not guaranteed any profit. Okay, you're in college. You're not guaranteed. Despite what admissions and the other people at Robert Morris tell you, and the placement people and the career service people, you're not guaranteed a job when you get out of here. You got to beat the pavement. Get your resume together. We all start doing that our senior year, right? We get our resume together. We beat the pavement. We make contacts. We network. We get involved with all these things to try to get a job, because the fact is we are not guaranteed a job. We are not guaranteed a profit. Okay? A monopoly guarantees a profit. There's something just morally wrong with that. And so I take it as a great victory that finally, I've had it happen. And you know what's funny? Is in the last week, I have received 3 telephone calls from different electricity provision companies offering me better deals. All of them involving cash rebates on my electric bill. After a year or 6 months, I'll get a check in the mail that'll be a cash rebate for a portion of my electric bill. Okay? Competition is furious, and I must take advantage of it. I have some friends in graduate school that did this with the telephone. That was when they were breaking up the telephone monopolies. And literally every month, they would change telephone systems. Because every month they would give them a deal. They'd be like, oh, come over to us now. We're starting to see this in television, in telecommunications and television, which pisses me off no end. Because I've been a loyal Comcast customer for 7 years, and I'm paying $250 a month for my cable. Now I have everything. I have expanded basic. I have all the movie channels. I have internet, all that, phone service, everything. Okay, but meanwhile, they're offering the same bundle to people who would switch over from Verizon or from DirecTV or from whatever the hell other provider they have, and they're offering it to them for $100 a month. It's like, well, what about me? What about your loyal customer? Okay, my wife tells me if I call Comcast and complain that they'll lower my bill. I haven't done that yet, but I really should. Okay. Now, with those things in mind, that's a monopoly. And that's how it functions economically. Now, horizontal mergers, these are just some examples of horizontal mergers. Standard Oil of Ohio, the Distillers and Cattle Feeding Trust Company, the American Sugar Refining Company, which we'll get to in a minute. They'll play a role when we get to, in Epic 2, the discussion of the rise of the American Empire in the early 20th century and the interventions that take place in Central America and Latin America. A lot of it is at the behest of the American Sugar Refining Company, the U.S. Rubber Company, which, oddly enough, the U.S. Rubber Company is going to become pivotal in U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict in the 1950s and 60s. And then finally, we have the U.S. Steel Corporation, which is the most famous of them. And you see, it's the largest corporation in the world when it forms in 1901. Vertical mergers, I've talked about before. We have a few examples here. We have Carnegie Steel, which owned the mines and the railroads. Okay, so in the steel industry, if I own the coal mines, the iron mines, and the railroads that transport everything, I've got a vertical merger. The American Tobacco Company, which owned the land, which grew the tobacco. They then owned the processing facility, which processed it in tobacco fit for cigarettes, and then they developed the cigarettes. Meat packing, Gustavus Swift. Federal Steel Company under J.P. Morgan, which will ultimately form with U.S. Steel, also a vertical merger. Okay. Now, in addition, we have a revolution in transportation. Now, what's this going to do? This is going to reduce, ultimately, the cost of production for industry because it's going to reduce the cost of transportation. Okay. We have some preliminary developments, and you see, again, this is data given from Walton and Rockoff. We have a precipitous increase. In 1811, you have a total of 1 ship with 400 tons displacement. By 1868, which is really the end of the Civil War, you have 874 ships with 212,200 tons in displacement. Okay, this rate drops the rates, which reduces the cost, which reduces the overall cost of production, which facilitates industrialization. In addition, you'll have the development of the canal system. Okay, this is pivotal. The most significant of which, the most famous of which, is the Erie Canal, developed beginning in 1816. It'll take them about 15 years to build it. What that's going to do is connect Lake Erie to the Hudson River. Now, why is this significant? Because when you connect Lake Erie to the Hudson River, you connect all of the Great Lakes region to the Hudson River. Okay, you can sail, you can produce stuff in Minnesota and Michigan, and then sail it down the Great Lakes to Lake Erie, then sail it across the Erie Canal into the Hudson River. And then from the Hudson River, it's a short jump down into the Atlantic Ocean, where you can then sell it overseas to the Europeans or to whomever. Okay? So that's gonna facilitate the development of industry as well, and allow for the expansion, particularly in the north. And that's something we want to keep in mind. Okay? We dealt with this in U.S. History 1 at some length. Okay, that most of the industrial development that takes place in the United States took place in the north. The south remained agricultural. Well, that's going to be true in this period too, The South will remain primarily agricultural, really, until recent times, the 1970s and 80s, when industry starts to go down there to take advantage of non-union labor, which is a lot cheaper. Okay, unions haven't had the success in the southern states that they have in the northern states. Okay, at this point, the productivity increases are all taking place in the north, particularly in the Great Lakes. This is why, for example, the automobile industry will ultimately focus itself in Detroit, the steel industry in Pittsburgh. Okay, the steel industry in Pittsburgh is because the connection with Pittsburgh is not through the canals; it's the Ohio River. Most of the steel production actually takes place on either the Ohio or the Monongahela. The Monongahela feeds into the Ohio feeds into the Mississippi and Illinois. Then from the Mississippi, it goes down to the Gulf of Mexico and then can be shipped overseas. Okay, all right. We see here the development of railroads, again, a precipitous increase in 1830. And again, this is from Walton and Rockoff. In 1830, there were 23 miles total. By 1900, this had expanded to 207,000 miles. By 1860, at the time of the Civil War, there were 30,626 miles, almost all of which, about 90% of which, was in the northern states. This was what allowed them logistically to have an advantage over the Confederacy during the war. Now, economic developments in the railroad, we have the development of an economy of scale, which I talked about earlier. And technological innovations. We want to take a look at these just for a second. Okay, you have more powerful locomotives and larger cars. That allows you to increase your carrying capacity. You have stronger steel rails. This also allows you to increase your carrying capacity because they can support greater weight. You have automatic couplers. The automatic couplers allow you to put more railroad cars on each train, which allows you to increase the amount that you're transporting at any one given point in time. And then you have air brakes. Well, what the air brakes are going to do is they're going to allow the trains to move faster because it's easier for them to slow down and brake with the air brakes. All of this is going to dramatically reduce the cost of rail transportation, which is going to reduce the cost of production for industry, which is going to facilitate the expansion of industry. Just kind of a conclusion. This is what we went over in this PowerPoint to pay attention to. First is the specialization transition, the comparative advantage transition that took place, light industry to heavy industry. This created the strain on the banking sector, which I talked about and we'll talk about again. As a result of this, we have considerable conglomeration. And actually, the conglomeration, just as kind of a side note, by the end of the 19th century, the conglomeration is going to lead to a reaction that is ultimately going to become incorporated in the progressive movement that's going to call for greater government regulation, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act, etc. You have corporate organization, most significantly the development of a limited liability corporation, and then transportation and technological advances. Okay, that concludes PowerPoint 1.2, and it's PowerPoint 1.1 and 1.2 that are going to be involved in quiz number 1 for this week, which will be due, just as a reminder, on Sunday at midnight. Okay,